Part 1. The Mystery of Babylon. How did one of the greatest cities in human history rise from a small settlement into the heart of a powerful empire, and then disappear almost completely from the world map? What is the truth behind the legendary Tower of Babel? Was Babylon truly the sinful city described in ancient texts and religious traditions, or is that image the result of centuries of exaggeration and misunderstanding? For thousands of years, the name Babylon has carried an almost mythical weight. It appears in the Bible as a symbol of corruption and arrogance. Greek historians described it as a city of unimaginable luxury and excess. Later traditions spoke of towering temples, massive walls, and even the legendary hanging gardens, one of the most famous wonders of the ancient world. But behind these legends lies a real city with a real history. A city that rose from obscurity in the fertile lands of Mesopotamia and eventually became the political, cultural, and religious center of the ancient Near East. Its story is not just about power and conquest. It is also a story of law, religion, ambition, rebellion, and decline. Over the course of more than 2,000 years, Babylon would rise to greatness more than once, only to fall again and again to new empires. So how did this remarkable city begin its journey? And what forces allowed it to transform from a minor settlement into the capital of one of the most influential civilizations of the ancient world? To understand the rise of Babylon, we must go back to the very beginning, long before the city became famous, to a time when it was little more than a small and unremarkable town on the banks of the Euphrates. Part 2. Babylon. Before power. Babylon did not begin its story as a great city. In fact, for a long time it was little more than a modest settlement in the vast and ancient landscape of Mesopotamia. Archaeological evidence shows that people had already been living in the area since the late 4th millennium BC. Yet for centuries, this small town remained largely insignificant compared to the powerful cities that surrounded it. The name Babylon itself carries a meaning that reflects its later religious importance. The word that reached us through Greek sources, Babylon, comes from the Akkadian term Bab-ilu, which means Gate of God. This Akkadian name was itself derived from an even older Sumerian expression, Kadigira, which also translates to Gate of God. Even though the city was still small at this time, its name already hinted at a sacred connection between heaven and earth. The earliest clear references to Babylon in written historical records appear during the final years of the Akkadian Empire. This was during the reign of Shar-Kali-Shari, the last powerful king of that empire and the great-grandson of the famous Sargon the Great. At this point in history, Babylon was still only a minor town with little political influence in the region. After the Akkadian Empire collapsed, the city came under the control of the third dynasty of Ur. During this period, Babylon functioned mainly as a provincial administrative center governed by officials sent from the royal court. It was not yet a major political force, but its location would soon prove to be one of its greatest advantages. Part 3. A strategic location. Although Babylon remained a relatively small and unimportant settlement for many centuries, it possessed one critical advantage that would later shape its destiny: its location. The city was situated between the great rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris, and the Euphrates, in one of the most fertile and strategically valuable regions of the ancient world. Babylon stood at a natural crossroads where several major trade routes intersected. Caravans carrying goods from distant lands passed through this region, connecting the agricultural cities of southern Mesopotamia with the northern territories and the wider Near East. At the same time, an extensive network of irrigation canals surrounded the area, allowing farmers to cultivate the rich alluvial soil fed by the rivers. Equally important was Babylon's position on the cultural boundary between two influential worlds. To the south lay Sumer, the land of some of the earliest cities and writing systems in human history. To the north was Akkad, whose rulers had once built one of the first great empires of the ancient world. Babylon sat directly between these two regions, absorbing influences from both. This unique geographic position created ideal conditions for future growth. Trade, agriculture, and cultural exchange all converged around the city. Yet despite these advantages, Babylon still remained overshadowed by older and more powerful city-states that dominated Mesopotamia. Cities such as Larsa, Ur, Eshnunna and Nippur held far greater political and economic influence. For a long time, Babylon remained in their shadow, waiting for an opportunity that had not yet arrived. But that opportunity would eventually come when the balance of power in Mesopotamia began to shift dramatically. Part 4. The Rise of the Amorites. By the late 21st century BC, the political order of Mesopotamia began to collapse. The powerful third dynasty of Ur, which had dominated the region for decades, was slowly weakening under increasing pressure from external enemies and internal instability. From the north came waves of Amorite tribes, while from the east, the Elamites launched destructive raids into Mesopotamian territory. In 2004 BC, the Elamite king captured and sacked the city of Ur, bringing an end to the dynasty that had once unified much of southern Mesopotamia. With the fall of Ur, the region entered a period of fragmentation and intense rivalry. Instead of a single dominant power, many independent city-states now competed with one another for land, irrigation canals, and control of trade routes. Cities such as Isin, Larsa, Eshnunna, and Nippur all struggled to expand their influence. In this environment of constant competition, even smaller cities suddenly had a chance to rise. Babylon was one of them. In 1894 BC, an Amorite leader named Sumu Abum seized power in the city. His rule marked a turning point in Babylon's history. From that moment onward, Babylon became politically independent rather than a provincial town controlled by outside powers. Even so, Babylon was still far from being the strongest state in Mesopotamia. Powerful rivals like Larsa and Isin continued to dominate the region. Yet Babylon managed to maintain its autonomy and slowly strengthen its position. Over time, the city's strategic location and its growing administrative system helped it develop the foundations for future expansion. What Babylon still lacked, however, was a ruler capable of transforming this small and rising city into a true power. That ruler would soon appear. Part 5. Hammurabi comes to power. In 1792 BC, a new ruler ascended to the throne of Babylon. His name was Hammurabi, the sixth king of the first Babylonian dynasty. At the time of his coronation, Babylon was still only one of many Amorite city-states scattered across southern Mesopotamia. The kingdom was stable, but it was far from dominant. The true centers of power were elsewhere. To the south, the city of Larsa controlled large and fertile territories. In the northeast, the kingdoms of Eshnunna and Mari held important positions along the trade routes. Meanwhile, Assyria in the north was beginning its own slow rise. Babylon existed among these stronger neighbors as a secondary state, respected but not yet feared. Hammurabi inherited a kingdom that had been carefully maintained by his predecessors. The administrative system was already well organized, and the economy was relatively stable. Instead of rushing immediately into war, Hammurabi spent the early years of his reign strengthening the internal foundations of his kingdom. He repaired irrigation canals that were essential for agriculture in the region. He brought order to the provinces and ensured that royal officials properly managed local affairs. Taxes were reorganized, and administrative structures were reinforced to make the kingdom more efficient and easier to govern. These reforms may not have seemed dramatic, but they were crucial. By strengthening the economy and consolidating royal authority, Hammurabi created the conditions necessary for Babylon to expand its influence beyond its borders. Only after securing his power at home did he begin to look outward toward the rival kingdoms that surrounded Babylon. And when he finally did, the balance of power in Mesopotamia would begin to change forever. Part 6. The Conquests of Hammurabi. The true transformation of Babylon began in the middle of Hammurabi's reign. For many years he had carefully strengthened his kingdom from within, but by the 1760s BC, he was finally ready to challenge the other powers of Mesopotamia. At that time, the strongest rival in southern Mesopotamia was the kingdom of Larsa. It controlled vast agricultural lands and important cities that had once belonged to older Sumerian states. In 1763 BC, Hammurabi launched a decisive campaign against Larsa. His forces defeated the kingdom and absorbed its territory, including several key cities of the south. With Larsa removed from the political map, Babylon suddenly stood as the dominant power in southern Mesopotamia. But Hammurabi did not stop there. Soon afterward, he turned his attention to the northeast, where the kingdom of Eshnunna had long maintained its independence and close ties with Elam. In 1761 BC, Babylonian forces conquered Eshnunna, bringing its lands under Babylonian control. Around the same time, conflict erupted with the Kingdom of Mari along the Middle Euphrates. Mari had once been a powerful center of trade and diplomacy, but it could not withstand the growing strength of Babylon. Hammurabi's army eventually captured the city and looted it, and its territory was absorbed into the expanding Babylonian kingdom. After these victories, Babylon emerged as the dominant power across a vast region. Hammurabi's rule now extended from the Persian Gulf in the south to the Middle Euphrates in the north. The kingdom controlled major agricultural lands, key cities, and vital trade routes. Through a network of appointed governors, Hammurabi maintained authority over this large territory, ensuring that canals, markets, and trade routes remained under royal supervision. Wealth flowed steadily into Babylon, and the city began to grow into the political and religious center of the region. Under Hammurabi, Babylon was no longer just another city-state. It had become the heart of the most powerful kingdom of its time. Part 7. Babylonian Society. As Babylon grew into the dominant power of Mesopotamia under Hammurabi, its society became highly structured and carefully organized. The population was divided into several social classes, each with its own rights, responsibilities, and legal status. At the top of the social hierarchy were the Awalim, the free citizens of Babylonian society. These individuals enjoyed full legal rights and could defend themselves in court. Most members of this class were nobles, wealthy landowners, merchants, military officers, and members of the administrative elite. They played an important role in political and economic life and often held positions of influence within the kingdom. Below them were the Mushkenum, a class whose name literally meant those who bow down. Unlike the Awilim, they did not possess full citizenship rights and often did not own land of their own. Many of them rented land from the royal palace or from temple institutions and were required to give a portion of their harvest in return. Despite these limitations, they were still recognized as members of society. They could own personal property and bring disputes before a court, though their legal standing was weaker than that of the Awalim. At the very bottom of the social structure were the wardum, or slaves. Slaves had no legal rights and were treated as property belonging to their owners. Some became slaves after being captured in war, while others fell into slavery because of unpaid debts or as punishment for crimes. Slaves could belong to the king, to temples, or to private individuals, and they could be sold, rented out, or transferred like any other possession. Beyond this clear hierarchy, Babylonian society was also shaped by family and religion. Families were organized under a patriarchal system, where the male head of the household held authority over its members. Women, especially those from wealthy families, could own property and sometimes managed businesses or served as priestesses in temples. Even so, they remained legally under the authority of male relatives. Religion also played a central role in society. Priests and priestesses connected to the cults of the gods, particularly the god Marduk, held a respected position and were often exempt from taxes and certain public duties. In this complex society of nobles, farmers, merchants, priests, and slaves, the need for clear rules became increasingly important. And it was Hammurabi who would create one of the most famous legal systems of the ancient world. Part 8. The Code of Hammurabi. Among Hammurabi's many achievements, none became more famous than his system of laws. Known today as the Code of Hammurabi, it is one of the best preserved and most well-known legal collections from the ancient world. The laws were carved into a tall stele made of black diorite stone and placed in a public place in Babylon so that people could see the rules that governed the kingdom. At the top of the monument was an image showing Hammurabi standing before the god Marduk, symbolizing that the king's authority came directly from divine power. In the opening section of the code, Hammurabi declared that the gods had chosen him to bring justice to the land. According to the inscription, the purpose of these laws was to destroy evil and injustice, to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak, and to establish order throughout the kingdom. For many years, scholars believed that Hammurabi's code was the first written law code in human history. Today we know that earlier legal traditions already existed in Mesopotamia. but Hammurabi's collection remains the most complete and influential example that has survived. The code addressed nearly every aspect of daily life. It contained rules dealing with trade, agriculture, family relationships, property disputes, labor agreements, and criminal offenses. The legal system also described how courts should operate and how judges should evaluate testimony. However, the laws were not applied equally to everyone. Punishments often depended on the social status of both the offender and the victim. A crime committed against a member of the upper class could result in severe penalties, while the same offense involving a slave might lead only to financial compensation. Many of the laws followed the famous principle, often summarized as an eye for an eye. If two people of equal status injured one another, the punishment was meant to mirror the harm that had been done. At the same time, the code also included protections for vulnerable members of society. Certain laws defended widows, orphans, tenant farmers, and workers by regulating debts and labor conditions. Through this legal system, Hammurabi reinforced the idea that the king stood above private interests and was responsible for maintaining justice throughout the land. The code helped unify Babylonian society under a single authority supported by both royal power and religious belief. But despite this organized society and powerful legal system, Babylon would eventually gain a very different reputation in the ancient world. Part 9. The myth of Babylon as a city of sin. Over time, Babylon became associated with an image that went far beyond politics, law, or military power. In many ancient writings, the city was portrayed as a place of luxury, excess, and moral corruption. This reputation would eventually give rise to the enduring idea of Babylon as a city of sin. One of the earliest sources for this image comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote about Babylon in the 5th century BC. In his account, he described what he claimed was a strange religious custom connected to the temple of the goddess Ishtar. According to Herodotus, every woman in Babylon was required, at least once in her lifetime, to go to the temple and offer herself to a foreign man as part of a sacred ritual. Later writers repeated and expanded this story, and over time it became widely accepted as evidence that Babylon practiced what modern scholars often refer to as temple prostitution. The idea was also reinforced in certain biblical texts, which used Babylon as a symbol of moral decadence and spiritual corruption. However, modern historical research paints a much more complicated picture. Despite centuries of repetition, archaeologists have never found clear evidence that an organized system of temple prostitution actually existed in Babylon. The ancient texts from Mesopotamia do mention priestesses associated with the cult of Ishtar, including a group known as the Kadishtu. These women were involved in religious rituals connected with fertility and sacred ceremonies. Yet it remains uncertain whether these rituals involved literal sexual acts or whether they were symbolic expressions of fertility and divine power. Many scholars now believe that Greek writers may have misunderstood or exaggerated religious practices they did not fully understand. It is also possible that Greek authors interpreted Babylonian traditions through their own cultural lens, portraying the East as a land of decadence and excess. In this sense, the famous image of Babylon as a city of sin may owe more to later storytelling than to historical reality. Still, the myth proved remarkably powerful. For centuries, the reputation of Babylon as a place of moral corruption continued to shape how the city was remembered in religious and historical traditions. But while these stories spread across the ancient world, Babylon itself was already beginning to face a far more serious challenge: the slow decline that followed the death of Hammurabi. Part 10. The decline after Hammurabi. When Hammurabi died in 1750 BC, he left behind a vast and powerful kingdom that stretched across much of Mesopotamia. At first glance, Babylon still appeared strong and secure. The empire he had built controlled important cities, fertile farmland, and key trade routes across the region. The throne passed to his son, Samsu-iluna, who inherited not only the crown, but also the enormous responsibility of maintaining his father's empire. Yet ruling such a large territory proved far more difficult than conquering it. Almost immediately, signs of weakness began to appear. One of the greatest challenges was economic. Hammurabi's long years of military campaigns had placed heavy strain on the kingdom's resources. Maintaining control over distant territories required large armies and constant administrative effort, and the economy began to struggle under this pressure. At the same time, several important cities in southern Mesopotamia began to rebel. Urban centers such as Uruk, Ur, and Larsa rose up against Babylonian rule, seeking to restore their independence. Among them, the city of Nippur resisted particularly fiercely. Despite efforts to suppress these uprisings, Babylon gradually lost its grip on much of the southern region. Areas that Hammurabi had once brought under his control slowly drifted away from the empire. Trouble also began to grow in the north. Assyria, which had previously been overshadowed by Babylon, was steadily gaining strength and influence. Meanwhile, a new group began appearing in Mesopotamian records, the Kassites, tribes from the Zagros Mountains to the east. At first, they appeared only occasionally as mercenaries, raiders, or small bands of settlers. But over time, their presence in the region would become increasingly important. The empire that Hammurabi had built with such careful planning and military success was beginning to fragment. And as Babylon weakened, new forces were preparing to take advantage of the situation. Part 11. The Hittite Sack of Babylon. As Babylon's power weakened in the centuries after Hammurabi's reign, the kingdom gradually lost control over much of the territory it had once dominated. Political authority fragmented, and the once powerful state became increasingly vulnerable to outside forces. By the middle of the second millennium BC, Babylon was no longer the dominant power in Mesopotamia. Local rulers began acting more independently, and the central government struggled to maintain control. This growing instability opened the door for new rising powers from beyond the region. One of these powers was the Hittite kingdom, based in Anatolia to the northwest. Around 1595 BC, the Hittite king Mursili-Esa-I launched a sudden and unexpected military campaign into Mesopotamia. His army moved quickly through the region and advanced directly toward Babylon itself. The city, already weakened by internal decline, was unable to mount an effective defense. Babylon fell to the Hittite forces, and the consequences were devastating. The invaders looted the city and killed the last king of the Amorite dynasty, Samsu-Ditana. With his death, the dynasty that had begun with Sumu-Abum and reached its height under Hammurabi finally came to an end. Yet the Hittites did not remain in Mesopotamia. After seizing their spoils, they withdrew back toward Anatolia, leaving behind a political vacuum in the region. Into that vacuum stepped the Kassites, the same mountain tribes that had gradually been appearing in Mesopotamian records for years. Babylon was now too weak to resist their rise. Rather than destroying the city again, the Kassites chose a different path. They took control of Babylon and began to rule it themselves, while preserving many of the existing political and religious institutions. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in Babylon's long history. Part 12. The Neo-Babylonian Revival. For centuries after the fall of the Amorite dynasty, Babylon continued to exist as an important cultural and religious center, but its political strength had declined. Different dynasties ruled the city, and powerful neighbors such as Assyria increasingly interfered in Babylonian affairs. By the 7th century BC, Assyria had become the dominant empire of the Near East. Its armies controlled vast territories, and Babylon itself often found its kings reduced to little more than local rulers under Assyrian supervision. Assyrian kings frequently intervened in Babylonian politics, removing rulers who showed signs of disloyalty and replacing them with governors loyal to Assyria. Although Babylon remained a sacred city and an important religious center dedicated to the god Marduk, its political independence had largely disappeared. However, the balance of power would eventually shift once again. In 626 BC, a Chaldean leader named Nabopolassar led a rebellion against Assyrian rule. Taking advantage of growing instability within the Assyrian Empire, he managed to drive Assyrian garrisons out of Babylon and was soon proclaimed king. This marked the beginning of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Nabopolassar quickly consolidated his control over southern Mesopotamia. He secured support from local elites and strengthened his authority throughout the region. But defeating Assyria completely would require more than Babylonian forces alone. The key to victory came through an alliance with the Medes, a powerful people from the Iranian plateau. Together, the Babylonian and Median armies launched a series of campaigns against the Assyrian heartland. In 614 BC, the ancient Assyrian capital Ashur fell to their combined forces. Just 2 years later, in 612 BC, the Allies attacked Nineveh, the great Assyrian capital. The city was destroyed in a devastating assault, and the last powerful Assyrian king, Sin-shar-ishkun, died during the fighting. With the fall of Nineveh, the Assyrian Empire collapsed. From its ruins, Babylon once again emerged as the leading power of Mesopotamia. A new golden age for the city had begun. Part 13, the age of Nebuchadnezzar II. After the death of Nabopolassar in 605 BC, the throne of Babylon passed to his son, Nebuchadnezzar II. Under his rule, the Neo-Babylonian Empire reached the height of its power and influence. In the early years of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar focused on securing Babylon's control over the western regions of the Near East. His armies campaigned across the Levant, bringing many cities under Babylonian authority and strengthening the empire's dominance in the region. One of the most famous events of his reign involved the Kingdom of Judah. In 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem. The city eventually surrendered, and its king Jeconiah was removed from the throne. Many members of Judah's elite, including nobles, priests, soldiers, and skilled craftsmen, were deported to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar placed a new ruler on the throne of Judah, a man named Zedekiah, who ruled as a Babylonian vassal. But within a few years, Zedekiah attempted to break free from Babylon's control and formed an alliance with Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar responded swiftly. In 588 BC, Babylonian forces returned and once again laid siege to Jerusalem. The city resisted for nearly 2 years, but in 586 BC, the Babylonians finally broke through its defenses. Jerusalem fell. The Great Temple of Solomon, the most sacred site in Judaism, was destroyed. The royal palace was burned and the city walls were torn down. Zedekiah was captured while trying to escape. According to historical accounts, he was blinded and taken in chains to Babylon. Much of the population was deported, an event remembered in history as the Babylonian captivity. While Nebuchadnezzar was expanding his empire through military campaigns, he was also transforming Babylon itself into one of the most magnificent cities of the ancient world. He launched an enormous building program that reshaped the capital. At the heart of the city stood the great temple of Marduk, known as the Esagila. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt and expanded the complex, decorating it with precious materials such as cedar wood, gold, and fine stone. Towering above the city was the massive ziggurat known as Etemenanki, often described as the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Rising nearly 90 meters high, this step tower dominated the skyline of Babylon. Many scholars believe it may have inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. The city's defenses were equally impressive. Nebuchadnezzar surrounded Babylon with massive double walls and deep water-filled moats. The most famous entrance to the city was the Ishtar Gate, built from brilliant blue glazed bricks and decorated with reliefs of lions, bulls, and dragons. Symbols associated with the gods, Marduk and Ishtar. From the gate stretched the processional way, a grand ceremonial road lined with carved lions. During major religious festivals, sacred processions would pass along this road toward the temples at the center of the city. Nebuchadnezzar also constructed a vast royal palace along the eastern bank of the Euphrates. According to later traditions, this palace complex may have included the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon, often listed among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. These gardens were said to have been built for the king's wife, Amytis, a princess from the mountainous land of Media. Having grown up in a cooler and greener environment, she reportedly struggled with the hot and dusty climate of Babylon. To comfort her, Nebuchadnezzar ordered the creation of terraced gardens filled with trees, plants, and flowing water. For more than 40 years, Nebuchadnezzar ruled Babylon at the height of its power. His military victories secured the empire's dominance, and his ambitious building projects transformed the city into one of the most magnificent urban centers of the ancient world. Yet even this golden age would not last forever. Part 14. The Fall of Babylon. After the long and powerful reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon entered a period of instability. The king had ruled for more than 40 years, and his authority had held the empire together. But after his death, the balance of power quickly began to weaken. Nebuchadnezzar was succeeded by Amel-Marduk, who ruled for only 2 years before being overthrown by his brother-in-law, a powerful general named Neriglissar. Neriglissar ruled until 556 BC, after which the throne passed to his young son, Labashi-Marduk. The boy's reign was extremely short. He was soon murdered in a palace conspiracy. Within just 6 years after Nebuchadnezzar's death, Babylon had already seen 3 rulers come and go, each removed through violent political struggles. The authority of the royal dynasty had been seriously damaged, and the stability of the empire began to erode. In 556 BC, a new figure came to power, Nabonidus. Unlike the previous kings, he did not belong to the royal dynasty. He was likely a high-ranking official or military leader with connections to the religious elite. His reign would become one of the most controversial periods in Babylonian history. Nabonidus attempted a major religious reform that deeply angered the powerful priesthood of Babylon. For centuries, the city's religious life had centered on the worship of the god Marduk, whose temple dominated the spiritual and political life of the capital. But Nabonidus began promoting the worship of another deity, the moon god Sin, pushing the cult of Marduk into the background. This decision weakened his legitimacy in the eyes of the Babylonian priests and many members of the elite. The king's authority had always been closely connected to the traditional religious system, and challenging that tradition created serious tension within the kingdom. Another source of resentment was Nabonidus's long absence from the capital. For much of his reign, he lived in Timur, an oasis in northern Arabia. There, he focused on controlling trade routes and caravan networks that crossed the desert. While he remained away from Babylon, day-to-day power in the city was left in the hands of his son Belshazzar, who governed in his place. To many Babylonians, the king's absence appeared as a sign of weakness. It also disrupted important religious rituals that traditionally required the king to be present in the capital, especially ceremonies honoring the god Marduk. Meanwhile, far to the east, a new empire was rapidly rising. Under the leadership of Cyrus the Great, the Persian Empire had already conquered several powerful kingdoms, including Media, Urartu, and Lydia. By the late 6th century BC, Babylon had become the next major target of Persian expansion. In 539 BC, the Persian army crossed the Tigris and advanced toward Babylonian territory. Nabonidus attempted to organize resistance, but the Babylonian forces were weakened and demoralized. The decisive battle took place near the city of Opis, where the Babylonian army suffered a crushing defeat. Soon afterward, the Persians approached Babylon itself. Unlike many other ancient cities, Babylon did not fall after a long and bloody siege. According to both Babylonian and Greek sources, the city surrendered with little resistance. One account claims that the Persians diverted the waters of the Euphrates River and entered the city along the dry riverbed during the night. Another version suggests that the city's gates were opened by Babylonian nobles who were dissatisfied with Nabonidus. Whatever the exact details, the result was clear. Babylon fell without major destruction. Nabonidus was captured, and Belshazzar likely died during the events surrounding the city's capture. When Cyrus the Great entered Babylon, he presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He respected the temples, restored religious practices associated with Marduk, and allowed the priesthood to continue their traditional roles. The Babylonian elites accepted his rule, and Cyrus proclaimed himself King of Babylon and King of all lands. With this event in 539 BC, the Neo-Babylonian Empire came to an end. Though it had lasted less than a century, it had become one of the most powerful and culturally influential states of the ancient Near East. Babylon itself continued to exist under Persian rule. For a time, it remained an important city within the empire and even served as one of its administrative centers. Later, in 331 BC, Alexander the Great entered Babylon after defeating the Persian forces. The city welcomed him as its new ruler, and Alexander even planned to make it the capital of his vast empire. But fate intervened. In 393 BC, Alexander died in Babylon, leaving his grand plans unfinished. After his death, the city eventually passed into the hands of the Seleucid dynasty, which founded a new capital elsewhere. Gradually, Babylon began to lose its economic and political importance. Trade routes shifted, administrative centers moved away, and the city slowly declined. Over the following centuries, Babylon faded from prominence. Its temples fell into ruin, its canals silted up, and its population steadily decreased. By the 1st century BC, Greek and Roman writers described Babylon as largely deserted. When Arab armies later conquered Mesopotamia in the 7th century AD, the once great city had already become little more than a field of ruins. Local inhabitants even removed bricks from the ancient temples to use in their own buildings. Yet the name Babylon never disappeared. Even after the city itself had vanished, its legacy endured in history, religion, and legend. For more than 2,000 years, Babylon had risen from a small settlement to become the capital of empires, a center of law, culture, and architecture, before slowly sinking back into the sands of the Euphrates. The physical city may have disappeared, but the story of Babylon remains one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of the ancient world.